Okay, so this lecture concerns Pennsylvania and the American Civil War. But before I go into the main bulk, if you like, of the lecture, I want you to think about why there was a civil war in America between 1861 and 1865. So, over to you first of all. Just think about why there was a civil war in the United States. Now, a lot of the answers that are given in return to this question are things like, or concern things like slavery, states' rights is another one that often crops up, conflicting civilizations is the theory that emerges, fanaticism, fear, stupidity, and perhaps, in some quarters, the goddamn Yankees. But maybe there weren't too many of you who thought that particular idea should ring true in this case. But the point is, there are quite a few reasons given by historians in particular as to why the South wanted to secede from the Union, and hence why there was a civil war in America during the 1860s. But for the purposes of this lecture, and essentially as I have done in virtually all of the lectures I've given to set the stage, to set the national stage before examining Pennsylvania itself, I just want to think about 5 core points. Remember, these are just my reflections, and through your own reading and research you may consider things or other things as being more significant. Or indeed you may wish to synthesize my thoughts and your own. It's really up to you. So the cause that most people cite for this, as a reason for the US Civil War, which is slavery. Let's look at this first. Well, in 1882 it was Jefferson Davis, former president of the Confederacy, who wrote that slavery, to quote, was in no wise the cause of the conflict, but only an incident. Generally, Africans were born the slaves of barbarian masters and taught in all the useful arts and occupations, reared in heathen darkness, and they were sold by heathen masters. They were transformed to shores, or they were transferred to shores, enlightened by the rays of Christianity. On the institution of slavery and the Abolitionist movement, Davis argued, never was there happier dependence of labour and capital on each other. The tempter came, like the serpent of Eden, and decoyed them with the magic word, freedom. He put arms in their hands and trained their humble but emotional natures to deeds of violence and bloodshed, and sent them out to devastate their benefactors. Jefferson Davis wrote this incidentally in The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, 1882. Now this, as you might have inferred, summarizes the Southern lost cause tradition. You may have noticed that it's somewhat ironic that in the wake of the Civil War, so much energy would be exercised not only by Southerners, I'd add, to try and to convince the American people and indeed the rest of the world that this shattering event was not about slavery. Now, it was in 1878 that Frederick Douglass emerged as one American willing to contest the lost causes point. He was fed up with the ways in which Americans were beginning to reconcile this bloody, terrible conflict around the mutual valour of its soldiers. And in his view, America was forgetting what the whole terrible thing might have even been about. And at the end of a magnificent speech he gave at a veterans' reunion, he said this: "The Civil War was not a fight between rapacious birds and ferocious beasts, a mere display of brute courage and endurance. It was a war between men of thought as well as of action, and in dead earnest for something beyond the battlefield." And again, I apologise for the disruptions in the lecture. There's now work going on outside. He went on and on and on to declare that the war had been about ideas, and he described the difference between those ideas, as he put it, as the difference between, to quote, barbarism and civilization. So here we have Douglas's take on the causes of the Civil War. Other factors link into this slavery thesis. And indeed, the fear thesis also helps us understand why Southerners sought secession and why the Civil War began. Perhaps strongest of all, there was an immediate kind of racial fear among Southern secessionists who felt that they lived on a potential racial powder keg. They feared the potential of a slave insurrection, especially if the South and slavery continued to shrink within itself. And that's why they sought to extend slavery to Western states through the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the latter of which, as I mentioned in the last lecture, deeply divided the nation. There's a phrase they kept returning to from Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech from 1858. He and the Republican Party, Southern secessionists, said, "We're going to put slavery on a, quote, course of ultimate extinction." Now that's fairly clear, isn't it? We're going to make your system extinct. How do you like that? And of course they didn't. Indeed, all over the rhetoric of secession, you find the language of, or the word, frankly, of submission. Submission, we will not submit, and so on. In Charleston, South Carolina, Robert Rhett, the editor of its most radical newspaper, the Charleston Mercury, ran a series of articles under the heading Terrors of Submission during the secession winter. And in one of those pieces, Robert Rhett wrote, and I quote, "If the South once submits to the rule of abolitionists by the general government, there is probably an end of all peaceful separation of the Union. We can only escape the ruin they mediate for the South by war. The ruin of the South by the emancipation of her slaves is not like the ruin of any other people. It is not a mere loss of liberty, but it is a loss of liberty, property, home, country, everything that makes life worth living." Rhett was full of some unctuous fury, without a doubt. Another fear deeply held in Southern secessionist circles was that their own growth, politically especially, was towards one of minority status. It was feared that the Republican Party in the North now had the potential, given the population of the North, to really take over the House of Representatives in huge numbers. Then, in 1860, you get Lincoln in the White House for 4 years. And secessionists thought, what if you get him for 8? And what if he appoints the next 2, 3, 4, 5 members of the Supreme Court? And he can control the diplomatic corps around the world. And even more importantly, he can control patronage of the post office system, which in those years, believe it or not, was very powerful. Nobody really cares about who runs the post office in the USA today, but back then they really did. Now, we can see in plantation owners' letters and their diaries, their speeches in secession conventions, that they feared the loss ultimately for their class of what James Rourke and other scholars have called planter control. So when people say secession was about slavery, they are accurate, but there were layers beneath it in what I'd call a kind of fear thesis. Another explanation is what we might call Southern nationalism, a sense of Southern unity, a dream for some Southern secessionists. Although a minority until the secession crisis of 1860 to 61, they dreamed of an independent Southern nation, of developing their own boundaries and their own potential expansionist foreign policy, where they could be, or would be, no longer dependent on the United States federal government. They didn't want yet more compromises, one after the other, with the Northerners. And to many Southern secessionists, it would be compromise with people they couldn't even conceive of compromising with. Free soil, anti-slavery, they believed, abolitionist, Republicans were the antithesis of what they believed in. Southern nationalists were led by people like Edmund Ruffin of Virginia, William Lowndes Yancey of Georgia, Robert Rhett of South Carolina, James D.B. DeBow, who published DeBow's Review, a very important Southern magazine out of New Orleans. Ruffin in particular was something of a zealot. So determined was he to try to gather the spirit of an independent Southern nation that, in the wake of John Brown Harper's Ferry in 1859, he himself went to Harper's Ferry and managed to collect 15 or 20 of John Brown's pikes. The pikes were given to slaves by Brown after his rebellion. And Ruffin sent one of those pikes to the governor of every southern state. These people then were into symbolism. As a note, and in case you're wondering, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was an effort by the armed abolitionist John Brown to initiate an armed slave revolt in 1859 by taking over a United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now, it's interesting that this sense of a Southern nationalism was born more of fear of an enemy than it actually was of any kind of planned vision of an organised nation. As numerous noted scholars of Southern nationalism, from Drew Forst to John McArdle and others, have argued, a Southern nation did not come out of this confederacy, but it was born almost overnight, and not by a lot of long-term planning. I should have said, actually, a Southern nation did come out of this confederacy, but it was not born overnight, and not by a lot. But it was born overnight, but not by a lot of long-term planning. Apologies, I think the distractions are actually getting to me a bit here. Right, okay. It was born then more in resentment and defensiveness of knowing what they were against and who their enemy might be, than it was actually born of a thought-out plan of what they were for. There was also a theory that the South's ultimate welfare would be better outside of the nation, or outside of the Union, I should say, than in, requiring a certain thinking about how to create a new nation. Okay, another explanation, a fourth explanation, and admittedly a rather vague one for the outbreak of a US Civil War, is what we might call agrarianism, the agrarian thesis, the idea of King Cotton ideology or King Cotton diplomacy, or, put more deeply, a kind of Jeffersonian yeoman idealism. This is the vague theory that secession was to protect an agrarian agricultural planter civilization. Southerners like to think of themselves, even the leadership, as a people or a republic of farmers, small farmers at that. Now, the majority of them were small farmers, and according to this argument, the real South was not in the slave-owning master class, but in the men of the soil, protecting a way of life against all that ignoble, go-getter, money-grubbing Yankee individualism. You can find these arguments all over the secession debates as well. Separate from those New Yorkers, they're going to take your wallet, or as the saying went, if you hit a Yankee, he wouldn't hit you back, but he would sue you. Now, this belief had a real vogue back in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, even into the 1950s and beyond. Its spirit is present in the Confederate anthem. Not Dixie, but the other Confederate anthem, the Bonnie Blue Flag. You don't hear this one as much, but there is a verse in Bonnie Blue Flag that the soldiers of the time sang all of the time. And it goes like this, and listen for its ironies. We are a band of brothers native to the soil, fighting for the property we gained by honest toil. And again, you can hear this on YouTube, I think. If you type in the Bonnie Blue Flag, you will be able to listen to the song and indeed the lyrics. Okay, the fifth reason then for the Civil War, that you could also argue that secession is deeply rooted, or was deeply rooted, in this notion of a tradition of Southern honour. The thesis here is that at the heart of the Southern planter crisis, in particular at the heart of their cohesion, their self-understanding and their worldview, was a set of values by which men, especially planters, defined themselves. Therefore, when their society and those values were threatened, they circled the wagons in defence. And these were the manly virtues, to quote, and the argument went, of honesty, trustworthiness, entitlement, social rank, the willingness to defend one's honour, blood, lineage, family, and especially home and or homeland. To defend one's community against not only invasion but also insult or humiliation, to save face in the presence of one's critics, one's enemy, was very important. Nothing could be worse, said the Honour Code, than public humiliation. Disputes, to the man of Southern honour, were personal, not a matter of law. And there comes a time, the argument went, when to hell with the Supreme Court, to hell with compromises in Congress. This is personal, so they said. Now, this honour thesis is the hardest to substantiate. You can, of course, see it in the language of the secession movement. To quote, "We must defend our honour, we must defend our society." But the questions then arise. When is the Southern secessionist planter speaking from honour, and when is he speaking from the preservation of the slave society? When is he speaking from his sense of agrarianism? When is he speaking from an independent vision, or speaking from a vision of an independent Southern national future? It's never easy to know, but you can hear it in a James Jones speech, for example. James Jones was a leading South Carolina secessionist in the South Carolina Secession Convention, who got up at the end of the arguments and said, "If we fail, we have saved our honour and lost nothing." Now think of the logic there. He doesn't really know precisely yet what they're going to fail at. If a whole civilization goes down in ashes, if a society will be destroyed as its roots, you've lost nothing. To our modern sensibilities, life doesn't usually equate with nothing, which perhaps makes this sentiment difficult to understand. But mix all of my explanations up together: slavery, fear, embryonic Southern nationalism, agrarianism, Southern notions of honour, and fold in a little bit of ambiguity, and you can begin to explain secession and hence the US Civil War. The South ultimately, and again, you can hold your own opinions on the causes of the US Civil War, but as I say, whatever the truth, the South broke away from the Union, and by besieging and capturing Fort Sumter in 1861, set the United States ablaze. The incredibly bloody Civil War which followed cost between 620 and 850,000 American military personnel their lives. That was equivalent to 2% of the population, 6 million people roughly speaking in today's terms. So the direction we'll take now is to look at Pennsylvania's role in the conflict. And it stretches significantly beyond the Battle of Gettysburg, which is what most people think of when they consider Pennsylvania and the American Civil War. So, as I've alluded to then, Pennsylvania played a key role in the American Civil War. Its industrial enterprise and natural resources were crucial factors in the economic strength of the Northern Union cause. Its railroad system, iron and steel industry, and agricultural wealth were vital to the war effort. Pennsylvania was a critical source of raw materials, particularly anthracite coal. All of the so-called smokeless coal used by the Union military was supplied by the Commonwealth. Bituminous coal, also used in the war effort, was largely provided by Pennsylvania. About 80% of all the iron used by the Union came from Pennsylvanian foundries, as well as significant quantities of flour, meat, foodstuffs, textiles, and uniforms. The Bethlehem Iron Works produced railroad rails and armor plating for the US Navy's ships. The largest producer of wrought iron artillery pieces for the Union Army was the Phoenixville Iron Company in Chester County, which at its peak churned out 50 3-inch ordnance rifles each week. Smaller facilities provided steel swords, rifles, pistols, tools, camp implements, tents, and other items used by the federal armies. Now, wars aren't just fought with weapons, and armies require many other supplies too. As Frederick the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte once said, an army marches on its stomach, and food is as crucial a necessity as anything else. Luckily for the North, Pennsylvania was a particularly productive and fertile state, one which had undergone in the antebellum era a number of transformations, as you'll remember. But the Cumberland County, for example, was among the very productive farming regions that supplied huge amounts of food and grain to the Union Army during the Civil War. The Commonwealth's railroads, which we discussed at some length last week, were also crucial in transporting materiel and troops during the American Civil War. Even though the civilian use of railroads predated the conflict, the war was the first time they played a major role in any form of war. Yes, absolutely, the US Civil War was in fact one of the first conflicts to the large-scale use of railroads for transportation. Now, the Union more widely held a significant advantage in regards to railroads and their infrastructure. Thousands of miles of track had already been laid at the beginning of the war, and the North controlled roughly 70% of these when compared to the South. Abraham Lincoln realized early on in the war that if he used the railroads to isolate major cities, he could limit their communication severely. The Confederates caught on to this and began retaliating by focusing on severing communication lines of the Union Army. And one of the main lines for the North, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Pennsylvania, was almost always under attack for this particular reason. In Pennsylvania, this railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad were of the greatest importance. The Northern Central Railway, which led from Harrisburg to Baltimore, Maryland and Washington, D.C., was also of key significance. So the Philadelphia region was a major contributor to the war effort. The Frankfort Arsenal was a vital source of small arms, ammunition, artillery shells, and time fuses to the Federal Army and state militia. Further west, Pittsburgh's heavy industry provided significant quantities of weapons and ammunition. The Fort Pitt Works near Pittsburgh made enormous iron castings for giant siege howitzers and mortars. The foundry produced 1,193 guns and almost 200,000 artillery projectiles. Other prominent Pittsburgh area factories included Singer, Nimick & Co. and Smith Park & Co., which produced, by Co of course I mean company, which produced more than 300,000 artillery projectiles. Collectively, Pittsburgh Industries manufactured 10% of the total US wartime production of artillery projectiles. The US Allegheny Arsenal was the primary military manufacturing facility for US accoutrements, as well as saddles and other cavalry equipment. In addition, it made as many as 40,000 bullets and cartridges every day. That's over 14 million per year, supplying between 5 and 10% of the Army's annual small arms ammunition requirements. The Philadelphia Navy Yard provided an important source of ships, sailors and supplies for the United States Navy during the war. As I've mentioned, the vast majority of the coal used by the Navy for its warships and blockaders came from underground mines in several counties in northern Pennsylvania. The shipbuilders of Pennsylvania, led by the famous Cramp Yards, contributed to the strength of the Navy and Merchant Marine, including the Civil War's first submarine, the Alligator, which was built at the Nefi and Levy shipyard in 1861 to 1862. If we think of manpower contributions as well, a total of 427,286 Pennsylvanians served in the Union forces, including 8,600 African American volunteers. This total, incidentally, includes the 40,002 Pennsylvanians who enlisted in the United States Navy. Many Pennsylvanian regiments, units, and indeed individuals played a key role in the war. For instance, 3 days after the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation calling out the militia of several states. In the face of a potentially sudden Southern onslaught against an unprotected Washington, D.C., 5 Pennsylvania militia companies were hastily called up and sent immediately to the capital. These later became known as the First Defenders because they were the first military units to reach Washington, D.C. The Army's upper also included many Pennsylvanians. The Commonwealth contributed 48 general officers and 14 commanders of armies and corps. Now, you can see these names on the PowerPoint slide, and at this point I'll give you a chance just to look through some of these. I do wonder if there are any that you recognise. I expect Meade and McClellan certainly would be recognisable to some of you. But anyway, have a look through them at that list. Okay, for me, some of the names that stand out beyond Meade, McClellan and so on are Admiral David Dixon Porter. He was a celebrated Union naval commander and was a native of Chester. Galusha Pennypacker of Chester County was the youngest general in either army during the war, and incidentally he remains the only general too young to vote for the president who appointed him. Indeed, he was born on June the 1st, 1844, so he was only 20 when appointed Brevet Brigadier General of the US Volunteers on January the 15th, 1865. He led the assault at the Second Battle of Fort Fisher, 1865, and was severely wounded in the process. Always exposed to fire, he is said to have been wounded 7 times in 8 months. Now, of course, these would be considered the notable Pennsylvanians who served in the conflict in terms of their rank and status. However, other less well-appointed Pennsylvanians made the bulk, it should be remembered, of the contributions to the Commonwealth's war efforts, and sometimes their tales are rather poignant. So first of all, Private Richard Montgomery of the 155th Pennsylvania Volunteers. He was the last enlisted man killed in the fighting in Virginia. He was killed at Farmville on the morning of the 9th of April 1865, shortly before Robert E. Lee surrendered his army of Northern Virginia to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. Private William Henry Christman, Company G, 67th Pennsylvania Infantry, was the first serviceman interred in Arlington National Cemetery on the 13th of May 1864. Private William Blatt of the 49th Pennsylvania Infantry was the first battle casualty interred at Arlington on Saturday the 14th of May 1864. Now, I say battle casualty to differentiate him from William Christman. Private William H. McGinney, aged 17, of the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry, was also interred on Friday, May the 13th, 1864. He was the first soldier to have family present at his funeral, which is very touching indeed. 7 commissioned officers of Company C of the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteers were killed in the line of duty, more than any other company in the Union Army. The 6th United States Colored Troops, an African American unit of the Union Army during the Civil War, recruited in Pennsylvania and trained at Camp William Penn, and it lost 62% of its men during an assault on Newmarket Heights near Richmond in 1864. 2 of its members received the Medal of Honor for gallantry. And Pennsylvanian women too made notable contributions to the war effort, and they distinguished themselves in many ways. In the years before the Civil War, the lives of American women were shaped by a set of ideals that history or historians have called the cult of true womanhood. As men's work moved away from the home and into shops, offices and factories, the household became a new kind of place, a private, feminized domestic sphere, a haven in a heartless world. True women, as they were called, devoted their lives to creating a clean, comfortable, nurturing home for their husbands and children. Now, the coming of the US Civil War challenged the ideology of Victorian domesticity, one that had defined the lives of men and women in the antebellum era. During the Civil War, American women turned their attention to the world outside of the home. Thousands of women in the North and South joined volunteer brigades and signed up to work as nurses. It was the first time in American history that women played a significant role in a war effort, or a truly significant role, or a crucial role in a war effort. Yes, there had been contributions to the American Revolution, but as I mentioned in the lectures last week, these were somewhat more limited. By the end of the war, these experiences had expanded many Americans' definitions of true womanhood. Pennsylvania women were particularly active during the war. For example, Anna Elizabeth was the first woman to address Congress at the age of 21. She earned a standing ovation on the 16th of January 1864 for The Perils of the Hour, a powerful speech about ending slavery. Here she criticized President Lincoln severely for his too moderate war goals, even as she urged continued support for him. Mary, or Mammy Ruggles, showed exceptional fortitude and defiance in the face of danger. As the Confederate Army entered York, Pennsylvania on the 20th of June 1863, the nurses of Penn Common, a York-based hospital, were determined to prevent its US flag from falling into enemy hands. When word of the Confederate Army's impending arrival reached the nurses, they lowered the flag, rolled it up, and stashed it under Nurse Mary Mammy Ruggles' skirt. Ruggles walked down George Street, right past enemy soldiers, until she reached her son's home and delivered the flag to safety. With each step she took, Ruggles said a prayer to save the flag from the Confederate soldiers all around her. Now, these are but 2 examples in an extensive list that will, of course, include thousands of forgotten individuals who gave so much to Union victory. Now, of course, today we've merely sampled the enormity of Pennsylvania's contribution to the war effort, one that, as I've alluded to, transcended race, class and gender. But the Commonwealth was a key contributor in so many ways to Northern victory, and without its efforts, who knows how the US Civil War would have ended. Not, of course, that I'm an advocate of counterfactual history. Okay, thank you very much for listening to this lecture. This is the last of my particular lectures. Dr. Matthew Stevens will take over next. But if you have any questions on what I've said in today's session, then please do let me know. And for the day students who are writing their own essays, you also, as I understand, have the option of choosing your own essay question or title. Then this lecture might speak to you, and there might be areas of this that you might want to explore further in your own research. Okay, that's it from me for now, and I look forward to seeing you in the seminar on Monday. Don't forget to do the associated online quiz with this particular lecture. Okay, thank you very much.